When I retired at 65, I thought I had everything figured out. I had a fixed income of about $2,000 a month, and like a lot of people, I started looking for a place where that money would actually be enough. I wasn't trying to get rich, and I wasn't trying to take risks. I just wanted something stable, somewhere I could live without constantly worrying about money. And everywhere I looked, I kept hearing the same thing: that you could live comfortably in the Philippines on $2,000 a month. Not just survive, but actually live a good life. The more I heard it, the more it started to feel like a safe decision. So I believed it. I did the research, I compared the numbers, and on paper it all made sense. Lower rent, lower food costs, lower overall expenses. Everything pointed in the same direction. So I made the move. And when I first got there, it actually felt like I made the right decision. The place I found was around $400 a month. Utilities didn't seem too bad. Food was cheaper than what I was used to. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like my money was finally working for me instead of against me. The first month stayed on track. The second month still looked fine. Nothing felt out of place. Nothing felt like a mistake. And that's when things started to change. Not all at once, and not in a way that stood out. Just small shifts. I started paying a little less attention to what I was spending. I started making decisions based more on comfort than on cost. Eating out a little more often. Choosing convenience instead of cooking. Going to places that felt familiar instead of sticking to a strict budget. None of it felt like a problem. In fact, it felt normal. I told myself I didn't move all the way across the world just to live like I was still struggling. And that's where I was wrong. Because those small decisions didn't stay small. They started adding up. What used to be maybe $200 a month on food slowly became $3, then $4, then closer to $500. Not overnight, but gradually, to the point where I didn't even notice it happening. At the same time, other costs started becoming more noticeable. Electricity was one of the biggest ones. Especially using air conditioning, it added up faster than I expected. Then there were things I didn't really think about before I moved. Visa extensions. Transportation. Unexpected expenses that just come up in everyday life. Each one manageable on its own. But together, they started changing my budget. And this is where the real problem started. Because I was living on a fixed income. If my expenses went up, my income didn't. And even if it was just a few $100s difference each month, that gap started adding up over time. First, I didn't think much of it. I would just cover the difference with savings and tell myself I'd adjust the next month. But the next month came and nothing really changed. And that pattern kept repeating. That's how it happens. Not one big mistake, but a series of small ones that slowly push you further off track. By the time I really sat down and looked at everything, several months had already passed. My spending had increased. My savings had started dropping faster than I expected, and the lifestyle I had adjusted to wasn't as easy to cut back from as I thought it would be. Because once you get used to a certain way of living, going backwards feels harder than you expect. Cutting expenses isn't just about numbers. It changes your routine. It changes your comfort. And it forces you to start thinking about money again in a way you thought you had left behind. And that's when the stress started to set in. Because now it wasn't just about enjoying retirement anymore. It was about maintaining it. What once felt like freedom started to feel uncertain. What once felt affordable started to feel tight. And what once felt like the right decision started to feel like something that might not last. So when people say you can live on $2,000 a month in the Philippines, they're not wrong. But they're not telling the full story. Because the real question isn't whether the numbers work on paper. The real question is what happens when things don't go exactly as planned. And that's the part I didn't think about until I was already living it. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Every expense started to feel different, and things that didn't seem like a big deal before suddenly stood out. I started noticing how often I was spending money without really thinking about it. Small things. Meals that were just a little more convenient, trips that didn't seem necessary but felt easy in the moment. Individually, none of it looked like a problem, but together it told a completely different story. And the hardest part wasn't seeing it. It was realizing how difficult it was to change it. Because by that point, it wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about habits. I had adjusted to a certain way of living, a certain level of comfort, and pulling back from that felt harder than I expected. It's easy to say you'll just spend less, but it's a lot harder to actually do it once it becomes your routine. So I tried making small changes, cutting back here and there, being more aware of what I was spending. But the reality was the gap was still there. And that's when it really started to sink in. Because it wasn't just about 1 month anymore. It was about what the next 6 months looked like, the next year. And when you start thinking that far ahead, the numbers start to feel a lot heavier. I realized that if nothing changed, I wasn't just slightly over budget. I was on a path that wasn't sustainable. And that's a different kind of pressure. Because now, you're not just thinking about today, you're thinking about how long you can keep this going. That's when the stress really started. Not all at once, but slowly. You start second-guessing decisions, checking your balance more often, doing the math in your head without even realizing it. And over time, that adds up too. Because the whole reason I made the move in the first place was to get away from that feeling, to feel like I had enough, to feel like I didn't have to think about money every day. But now I was right back in it. And that's when I had to make a decision, not about whether the Philippines was the right place, but whether my plan actually made sense. Because those are two very different things. A place can be affordable and still not be affordable for you. That's something I didn't fully understand until I was already living it. I started looking at my numbers more seriously, not just what I thought I should be spending, but what I was actually spending. And the difference between those two numbers was the problem. Because the plan I made before I moved wasn't the life I was actually living. It's easy to plan a budget, but it's a lot harder to live inside it. And if your plan doesn't have room for real life, for changes, for mistakes, for things you didn't expect, then eventually it breaks. Looking back on it now, I don't think the mistake was the Philippines. I don't think the mistake was even the number. The mistake was how confident I felt in a plan that I had never actually lived. Because it's one thing to sit down and calculate what something should cost. It's something completely different to live it every day, to make those decisions in real time, and to see how quickly small changes can turn into something bigger than you expected. I thought I had enough, and on paper I probably did. But real life doesn't stay on paper. It moves, it shifts, it changes. And if your plan doesn't have room for that, then eventually you start feeling it. Not all at once, but slowly. And by the time you recognize it, you're already dealing with the consequences. So if you're thinking about making a move like this, or planning your retirement around a number like this, the best thing you can do isn't just ask whether it works on paper. It's to ask yourself how much room you really have when things don't go exactly as planned. Because that's the part that matters. And that's the part most people don't fully understand until they're already living it. I didn't.